This is going to be a bit of an informal video where I kind of just rant and ramble about my opinions and thoughts on the current state of the sci-fi genre. You really may not know it looking at my channel, but I actually much prefer sci-fi to pretty much any form of writing out there. I love the mentality behind the genre, exploring the universe through, introducing new elements to humanity, examining what it means to be human, and just taking us apart and our place in this universe through just simple ideas, or adding maybe just one ingredient to the situation humanity's in and seeing how that would alter our daily life. What I just described is classic sci-fi, and the outcome from those little experiments were almost always a very nihilistic view, saying humanity doesn't really matter, or saying that our place in the universe is so insignificantly small that we aren't really as important as we think. You can see that in countless books and writings. There's almost never a positive outcome in classic sci-fi, or if there is, it's just kind of overshadowed by maybe a more negative feeling. An example of what would consider to be a happy ending in classic sci-fi would be like Childhood's End, which is not exactly a happy ending. It's just not a typical conclusion, and that's something that's very important to realize about classic sci-fi. Is during its time, it subverted many classic writing tropes. It didn't have the wholesome story with the very finished, polished conclusion and the happy hero that you can follow. Very often there wasn't a super happy ending, and the conclusion left the reader wanting more, or with not a very sense of completeness. It questioned our mentalities as society and culture, and I really liked that. I thought it was a good thing to have this genre that kind of pushed the reader's ideas and limits. Modern sci-fi has very much so kind of forsaken its roots. It more and more just resembles kind of modern day fantasy or fiction as a whole, and their writing mentalities in terms of having a hero with a happy ending and kind of this wholesome conclusion. Its nihilistic roots are almost completely gone. We are seeing more and more in modern sci-fi an influence where if it does add one of those ingredients, because often it doesn't even do that or even focus on one ingredient, it's just an entirely new scenario to have a futuristic setting for your story, and that one mentality of exploring the one implication of that one ingredient's dead. Now it's just, here's a whole new setting, here's your typical adventure, and you're going to have this happy ending. And while it still is great, and there still are some amazing stories within this setting, I mean, I just gave a very positive review to Artemis because it does that very much so. It's disappointing because I liked the more kind of rogue genre that we had with authors like Isaac Asimov, Heinlein, kind of pushing the boundaries. Arthur C. Clarke, just to throw out another name. We don't have that as much anymore. It's becoming much more of a mainstream mentality, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I miss classic sci-fi, and there is still a healthy root of classic sci-fi classic sci-fi type material still being made, but it's just not on the same level or as popular within the genre as it once was. And I really do blame Star Wars for this, which it's funny, my favorite movie franchise of all time having this negative, or in my opinion, negative impact on my favorite genre is a little disappointing, but it's undeniable. After Star Wars came out, it became the 0 point for what a lot of people considered sci-fi. And I cannot say this strongly enough. Star Wars is not science fiction. You can even see George Lucas pretty much saying the exact same thing. What he did was he got inspired by samurai movies, which were originally inspired by westerns, which were originally inspired by samurai. There's a whole history there too, the back and forth of the movie genres of westerns and samurais, but this is not what this video is about. It's about sci-fi, and what he did was he basically made a western and decided to reskin it to be in space. Well, he made a samurai western and put it in space. And a lot of people just assumed that was sci-fi because, hey, it's futuristic. It has to be sci-fi, right? That's the default value of sci-fi. I very much so disagree with that idea. I think sci-fi is more just the It's like it literally, it's science fiction. So you need to take an idea or a piece of technology or something that is scientific, a philosophy, something like that, introduce it into society or humanity in some way and explore its impacts. That's sci-fi to me. You could do sci-fi in the Stone Age right if you dropped in a gun or a ray gun into a medieval town and just saw what the ramifications of, to them, this godly weapon would be. That would be more sci-fi to me than Star Wars. Now, I'm not trying to bash Star Wars. You know me, I love Star Wars a lot, but suddenly you had a new generation of authors coming up whose 0 point of what sci-fi should be was Star Wars, because that's what they had growing up. And so they started writing books, and they're good books, but they have a different mentality. They have the farm boy going against the Imperials and all this, kind of the story of kind of the cowboy and Han Solo and all this being the new focus of the sci-fi genre. And it's this one movie franchise changed these books so drastically to a point where I'm almost a little missing. I miss the classic sci-fi, especially the nihilism that was there, and making kind of the reader question so much about their reality. And there is still that kind of mentality in a lot of sci-fi movies that are coming out. I would say Blade Runner 2049 is an amazing example of that. But seeing the sci-fi movie genre being more aligned with that idea than the current state of the book genre makes me just realize, okay, well, the movies now are coming out are almost always based off books, and eventually we're just going to see the movie sci-fi genre be plagued with just sci-fi books based off this generation. So it's going to be much more about the typical thing. Annihilation is a good example of something that felt a lot more like classic sci-fi to me. I didn't love the movie. I thought it was very good, but I didn't think it was great. And to me, it felt a lot more like that exercising of classic sci-fi ideas. I've even heard people say that Marvel movies are sci-fi, which to me is so silly because there's literally magic in it with like Thor and Doctor Strange. There is no implications for humanity. There's no exploring what, if they were exploring how introducing, someone like Tony Stark would change society, then you might have an argument, but that's not it at all. It's just, I love Marvel. You guys know I do, but calling it sci-fi to me is wrong. And this is all just coming from a personal place. Don't take this as I'm not the word of God when it comes to book genres. I just think this evolution from classic to modern sci-fi has really changed the fundamental roots of the sci-fi genre. And I'm not saying modern sci-fi is not science fiction. I'm just saying the ideology behind it is just completely different. Whereas you look at the evolution of fantasy, there are smaller changes like focusing on character more, focusing on non-traditional, story arcs as much, not just typical bad guys, typical good guys. You have a lot more of the middle ground. Now in some modern fantasy books, we're following the bad guys, like in Gentlemen Bastards. You're following the criminals. But science fiction didn't change minor focuses like that. It changed the philosophy behind it. In fact, I think it scrapped having philosophy behind it. Now it's just put it in a futuristic setting, sci-fi. And I just don't like that. I think there needs to be a greater qualifier to it. Just like high fantasy. You can't just write a fantasy book and call it high fantasy. You need to develop a magic system, a world, different races, things like that to qualify. And I want the same kind of qualifiers to still be there for the sci-fi genre. And I might sound super pretentious here, but I'm not saying they're inherently better. I'm not saying I don't enjoy modern sci-fi still. It's just when I read it, it doesn't feel like sci-fi to me. It feels like something else. I just want I want to read more books that their point is to make you question why you're here, or make you question, is humanity good? What would happen if we cured death? My dad gave me a series of short stories by Robert Heinlein called The Past Through Tomorrow, and the implications of every book are so good. And I've yet to, one story hasn't made me kind of had to sit back and really think about what I should be taking away from what I'm reading, because every short story takes one idea, implements it in society, and examines what that change will do. And I think that's beautiful. I think that is so pure in a way, but I get why it's not super popular, because it doesn't give you the cathartic conclusion a lot of people go for in stories, because there's not always a cathartic conclusion. They're trying to go for a realistic outcome. I think the first story of the Pass Through Tomorrow is about someone who invents a machine that can tell people exactly when they're going to die. And they do some like loose whatever BS explain it through science thing, but that's, you have to do that to make it seem grounded. And then they go, okay, what would the implication be? Well, insurance companies fall apart. People start taking advantage of the system. Economic shifts happen left and right. There's all these horrific moral implications. There's some really sad scenes where, they see people just, oh, this person's going to die in 20 minutes. There's things like that. And I really like that. And no, there's no emphasis on character. There's very rarely good emphasis on character in classic sci-fi, or even very often not even good world building, because they just want to build this idea and show you what this idea will do. And I think it's just so different that to see it almost entirely fall off. And there are still some books coming out that do this, but not nearly as common and not nearly as well done. So that is why I personally, I'm just going to be putting this video out there. It's just a bit of a rant and a ramble, but I think it's something that we would benefit from, to go back to the more simplistic sci-fi that did a deeper dive into just what does this one implication mean. And just on a side note that I'm going to end on here, the books that still do come out that focus on exploring this one idea, it's almost always AI now. The modern sci-fi that explores one thing, it's exploring AI, which I get, because AI is on the verge of happening. It's very real in our society, and this genre wants to do something that people can relate to. So it's okay, if we introduce AI right now, how would it do? And it's the evil AI, or it's not evil AI. Sometimes it's humanity that's evil to the AI. It's just, that's not what it always has to be. Sometimes it can be, if you want to be a little more kooky of the sci-fi aliens, or it can be a piece of tech, or it can be, a new government way, a new philosophy. 1984 is a good example of that, kind of having, okay, what would happen if this dystopia kind of took over? I would consider that science fiction dystopia, or dystopian sci-fi. I said it wrong the first time. So I think that's also something that, we would benefit from bringing back. I guess if you want a more direct example, if you don't really believe what I'm saying, go and look at Star Trek, something that back in its heyday, especially with second generation, was the pinnacle of sci-fi. People considered it to be, this is the best on-screen representation of what sci-fi means. And what it was, every episode, most episodes, there were some bad episodes, but almost every episode, it did exactly what I'm talking about. Compare that to what it's become now, and it's much more of just like a standard action flick. You're just getting these, and I actually really enjoyed the new Star Trek movies. I haven't seen the newest one, but I enjoyed the first two. But the newest Star Trek movie, well, one, it was directed by the guy who did Fast and the Furious movies. If that doesn't tell you something, it should. And the new TV show, which I watched only a couple episodes of, just completely forsakes the mentality of the original Star Trek of really exploring the universe and trying to find humanity's place in it. Where does morality fit in when you're out in the middle of the black abyss that is space? Now that's gone. Now it's just action again, which again can be a lot of fun. But I would consider Seth MacFarlane's The Orville to be better sci-fi than the new Star Trek show, and therefore I would consider it to be better Star Trek, which is shocking to say the least. I like Seth MacFarlane quite a bit, so I knew I was going to find his show funny, and it is legitimately funny, but it's also got some really deep episodes that really make you question so much, and you can tell Seth MacFarlane was a Star Trek nerd growing up, because he did the show justice. And if you have not checked out The Orville, push through the first episode and then just kind of watch the next two, and if you're not hooked by then, I apologize for wasting your time, but I think you will be, because I think it's a remarkably well done show. That does sci-fi justice. It does a very good job of everything I talked about and kind of just finding our place. Because I think that should be the mentality, especially of space exploration sci-fi. Find your place. I don't know. That is pretty much all I have to say about the sci-fi genre. It was just on my mind, and it's something my dad and I share quite a bit of passion about. I'm not saying modern sci-fi is not science fiction. I'm just saying, to me, it's changed in such a drastic way that it's hard for me to get the fulfillment I get from classic science fiction with what's coming out currently. And what coming out currently kind of scratches the itch for me when it comes to just like a good, action flick or whatever. But it's just not the same philosophical exploration. I probably sound super pretentious on all of this, but it's just my thoughts. Hope you're having a good one. Like and subscribe, support the channel any way you can. I hope you enjoyed the video. Peace.